Pretty Derby, Road to a Top, Beginning of a New Era, Cinderella Grey. All of them have something in common. You might be thinking that I'm saying that all of them came from the same franchise called the Musume franchise, which is true, but not the entirety of it. No, what I'm referring to is not something as simple as that, but rather something more personal, and it's the fact that every single one of them managed to exceed my expectations in a big way. Every single one of them made me feel something. They made me be engaged with the story. They made me laugh. They made me cry. They made me be excited for a sport that I have never seen before. And all of them, little by little, kept gaining a bigger and bigger spot in my heart. Up until the last season that has come out so far, Cinderella Grey. Although not all of them came from the anime, even though multiple of them are anime exclusives, there is one story that is fully based on a manga. One story that has been deemed to be the so far best piece of media of the entirety of the franchise, and I'm talking about the Cinderella Grey manga. Hello there. After the first thing that I said of having my expectations being easily exceeded by every single piece of media of this franchise, you would have expected that I would learn my lesson, right? Yet, here we are. Even after the fantastic anime of the Cinderella Grey story, I had my expectations extremely high, yet somehow this anime, this manga, this franchise, as always, managed to exceed those expectations, even when they were so high. So I want to talk about them. Because I read the manga from chapter 1 and I did not skip a single one of them, despite the fact that a lot of them cover the anime, I have the knowledge that most of it is an insanely faithful remaking of the story. Almost everything is one-to-one, but in a good way. They were clearly not expecting that most people would go out and read the manga, and I think that is fine, because this is extremely faithful to a point that is almost a carbon copy, with the exception of, the drawing and the hype moments and all of that, but it's still fantastic. However, there's just like two small things that are changed. The first one is the Inari 1 backstory, which is after the anime in the manga, but they put it in the ending because they want to hype up for the second season, which is fine. And there's also the part of the ending in which Belnolite congratulates Oguri, and it was an anime exclusive. It's obvious that they did it because it was the season ending, which is like, you are not gonna do that in the manga. But as I'm saying, it made perfect sense and it was a very cool addition for the anime. Outside of that, after reading it, I can confidently say that the manga is better in almost every single thing to the anime. Yeah, almost everything. And that is saying a whole lot. But before moving forward, I want to make a small cut and ask you all to please leave a like and subscribe. If you like this type of content, it would help the channel to grow and it would make me realize that you actually like it. So with that out of the way, let's keep moving. This video is gonna be cut in like 3 parts because we already talked about everything related with the anime in other video. I'm not gonna include those parts. The manga, as I said, is extremely similar to being almost identical to the anime. So what I can say about it is just that the drawings are really good and not much else, to be honest. There's not much else to add outside of that. So I'm gonna divide it in the 3 parts that are after the anime, which is gonna start with the 3 legends, which is the whole arc of Oguri Cap, Super Creek, and Inari 1. To be honest with you, this part kinda extends after the part 2, which I'm gonna talk about, but it's not that big of a deal. The reason to why I'm starting with the 3 legends is because it's the first thing that we know afterwards. They're a very important group in the history of Japanese horse racing because they are basically the ones that started the previous or former golden era of all of this Japanese horse racing before the actual golden era. The other reason why I want to start with this is because this is the least quote-unquote least important part or least interesting in the entirety of the manga moving forward. Because the characters are not that much of rivals. You see, at this point we see that Oguri is the champion, is already considered to be the best horse in all of Japan, and as such, now she is not just a contender, but rather the one to beat. And that makes that the dynamic once again goes through all of those things of she being like the main target. Even if it's not as obvious as it is in the first season with that race that she won, the Mainichi Okan I think that it was. So everyone is looking at her and she is the main target basically. So in this point it's kinda like we do not have a lot to add to the Oguri character. So she is not particularly interesting to talk about individually after talking all of what I just said in the previous video. So in reality I'm gonna talk about just two things, which are Super Creek and Inari 1. And the thing is that Super Creek is very quick to talk about. Super Creek turns into this villainous persona which is very accurate to a real life horse. And I really like the switch on all of the thing that Super Creek was supposed to be this extremely cute character and all of that, that all of a sudden is the threatening one. Because it makes sense at the end of the day. She wants to run against Oguri and she wants to defeat her and she wants to write her own story. So it makes sense that for the entirety of Japan, where Oguri is like the horse to beat, she's gonna be a villain, and she fully embraces that. All of those panels of Super Creek looking like an absolute maniac are all of them in this part of the story, and they are really cool, and they portray perfectly what Super Creek ends up becoming. And I think that when you see those races and how she at some point wins against Oguri, which I'm not gonna say specifically, but I guess that you can assume that if this is the Three Legends era, you could have assumed that she at some point won against Oguri. She was a very well written character. However, she is not my main focus of this part of the story, but rather Inari 1. You see, the reason why I mentioned that this part is the quote-unquote less interesting of them all is partially because of what happens. You see, after the race that Oguri wins, her first G1 win, the last race of Tamama Cross, you know, the ending of the anime, she gets injured and Super Creek also gets injured. So basically for like half of the first year of Inari 1, we actually do not see any of what she's doing. You know, with basically every other kinda important character, we see something happening with them prior to their introduction. Like with Super Creek, we see her win the Tenno show. I think that is the Tenno show, I don't remember exactly right now, but I think that is that one. With Tamamo Cross, we see her win at least one G1, maybe multiple of them, I'm not certain right now. We even see it with other characters like Jaino Muteki, or even the combination of Mejiro Ardan and Sakura Chiyo no O, which is also one of my small complaints about this part. Like, with all of the focus that they got to Chiyo no O, obviously because of the reason that Oguri was not participating, but the fact that she was referenced and she does literally nothing in the manga, like she is just a side character that doesn't race basically ever again, it feels kinda weird. But yeah, that is one of my reasons as to why this feels like an awkward part, because this girl in 91 doesn't get that. Outside of the races back in her town, we have nothing. Literally nothing from her. Another thing of she being a hot-headed girl is true for most of her story. It feels like she has little to no development for almost like most of half of the time that she appears on screen, which is extremely weird, and it makes you feel that she's gonna be a huge disappointment of a character until one character comes to save the day, which is Mr. CB. Mr. CB, if you do not remember, is the girl that appears alongside Marusensky and Symboli Rudolph. She was a Triple Crown winner the year prior to Symboli Rudolph, so she is a big deal in that war. And she goes and helps her in a way, because one of the things that Inari had was a big issue is the fact that she forgot her reason to race. She was racing to win, which is not the way to go. And Mr. CB reminded her what was the actual thing that you have to do when you race, which is be happy and race for fun before racing for winning. And that makes a huge switch in Inari 1 as a character overall and makes her better for the future. Is she still a hot-headed girl? Kinda, but it's much more satisfying to watch her win a race once she goes through that development than what she was before. It makes it feel logical, and it's actually like the biggest contributing factor as to why this part is actually good, even though it's, as I'm saying, the weaker part of the three that I'm gonna mention. Is because of the development of Inari 1 and she actually being a fantastic character, which is weird because she's never that big of a deal as a rival. In fact, the whole focus of the quote-unquote rivalry is mostly just on Super Creek, to the point that you almost forget that Inari 1 is actually more important than Super Creek for the story of Japanese horse racing. And the crazy part with all of this is that, at least in my opinion, Inari 1 is actually kind of a better character by itself than Tamamo Cross, even though she's way worse as a rival because she almost doesn't feel like a rival, period. Yet despite all of that, she managed to be such a compelling character in that span of time that she managed to develop that is phenomenal. She is never as threatening as Tamamo Cross nor as Super Creek, but she is like the best character of all three of them, and is the one that goes through the most development, and I really enjoy that development because that is one of the few things that was missing in this show. A secondary character that was not a friend of Oguri Cap that actually went through a lot of development for a long period of time, and I really appreciate it. But after that, or basically in the middle of that Three Legends saga, there is one arc that is the most important of them all, which is the, obviously, as usual with this show, Japan Cup of 1989.
It's hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.
With this second Japan Cup, just like in the anime, is actually the best, in my opinion, individual arc in this whole show and in this whole manga, and is not particularly close, outside of something that we're gonna talk later on, but that is kinda cheating. We have a much stronger cast of secondary characters, which is very good, especially considering that the original Japan Cup was actually like very good with those characters, but this one makes it even better. The secondary horses in this race are easily better than the ones of the original Japan Cup, even though they are still not absolutely fundamental focuses. They are definitely better than the ones of the previous one, which are like Ellerslie Pride and Mitchell My Baby, which are like, you are there, congratulations I guess. But no, they actually are more interesting here. And this insane race would definitely not be possible without the starting support of both Tiff Crow and Eve Binti. Both of them immediately clash into a front-runner battle to see which one can stay as the first place for the longest time. And that was absolutely fantastic because it actually set the pace for insane things to happen. Why is something like that important? Well, because this race is called the incident, and I'm gonna make a brief mention of that. One of the main reasons to why this Japan Cup was so historic was because of the insane pace that they had throughout the entirety of the race. The former record of the Japan Cup was 2 minutes, 24 seconds, and if I'm not mistaken, 8 tenths of a second. Out of the 15 horses in this list, 13 of them surpassed that previous record. Almost every single horse would have break the previous record and would have been comfortably winners in any other year. In fact, it's even more glaring when you compare it with the previous Japan Cup, because if you go for the winner of the previous one, which was Obey Your Master, she got a time of 2:25 and something, which would have added yet another horse to the threshold. So quite literally, every single horse in this race, for the pace that they got, would have won the previous one. And that's why this is such a historic race, because it was absolutely groundbreaking to see so many horses doing so well, and that would be impossible without the insane support of Eve, Binti, and Thief Crow. It was such an insane pace that they even acknowledged it within the race itself, which is extremely hilarious because it reminds me of another very famous panel from Blue Lock, which you know has always been a meme as to why this exists as a panel in a, football manga. Well, in Uma Musume they do the same thing, kinda, which is like, girl, I know within context that this makes sense to be said, but what are you doing saying that everyone is gonna die in a race? It's absolutely hilarious, but it shows you how big of a deal it was, probably even for both the jockeys and the horses inside of it when it happened. But then we have the actual stars of the show fighting each other. From the get-go, prior to the actual start of this arc, or basically prior to the start of the race, everybody was anticipating the battle of Oguri Cap versus Obey Your Master, also known as Pay the Butler. I absolutely adore how they show this race and this part of it. It is truly majestic, it is fantastic. It has the best version, in my opinion, of Obey Your Master that even enhances the already fantastic character that she had from the first Japan Cup. And this is the race for the 1 and 2nd spot that everyone wanted to see until it wasn't. Because yeah, in the middle of Obey Your Master versus Oguri Cap, there was one star that was shining even brighter than both of them. And that is the one that I'm gonna make the mini A and B of every video. I'm referring to the horse called Horlicks, but known in the Uma Musume war as FolkQUEEN. The story of FolkQUEEN is so good that I cannot state it in a video, and it's the whole reason as to why I refer to both Obey Your Master and FolkQUEEN with their real horse names, because it made me realize how important is this story and how much I have to pay respect to the horses behind this, because the story of Horlicks is amazing. In summary, Horlicks, also known as FolkQUEEN, was a horse from New Zealand. If you remember that I mentioned something, Ellerslie Pride was the previous representation of New Zealand, but the real life horse, Bone Crusher, was supposed to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest, New Zealand horse ever. And when it was such a disappointment in the Japan Cup, everyone started putting their expectations in FolkQUEEN. However, Horlicks was not a normal horse, and the pressure put on it was absolutely massive. It was a lot of things at the same time. It was the most important representation of her whole continent, a continent that was yet to win their first Japan Cup, and was the dream for everyone there to win it. But also, it was in a war of horses and male horses. Because yeah, after all of what I just said, Horlicks was the first horse in the history of Oceania to win the Japan Cup, and she did it as a female horse. And the way that that is represented in story is so perfect and so good, to the point that it was one of the few times in my life that I reread the entirety of an arc right after finishing it because of how good it was. Horlicks, or in this case FolkQUEEN, had the pressure and the weight of her entire country and maybe even continent on her shoulders. She was supposed to be the new Ellerslie Pride, and the second that Ellerslie Pride loses badly in the Japan Cup, everyone starts looking at her like the new Ellerslie Pride. She stopped being an individual, but rather an idea for others. She was not a person, or not even an Uma. She was her hope, the hope of her nation, but not a person behind it. It was just the idea, and she had to have that burden for so long, up until the final ending of the Japan Cup. She was never seen as anything more than the second of Ellerslie Pride. She was never seen as more than that. And then one character sees her as what she truly is, which is FolkQUEEN. And you can imagine that that was Oguri Cap. And the whole story, how they managed to portray the emotions and the despair of a character suffering what she had to suffer, which is something that happens in real life with so many different people getting the expectations of others put on them just because the previous one failed. And she represents all of that in such a fantastic way in just like 2 chapters. I really love the story of Obey Your Master, and I really believe that she is still one of the stronger individual arc characters out there in all of this show. However, FolkQUEEN managed to get it a step forward, and is what I actually say to be maybe one of the best characters from an individual arc in all of manga. And I'm not saying this lightly just because I have read a lot of manga and I have seen a lot of anime. So me saying something like that should tell you everything you need to know. Characters like Bondrewd or Ringo Rodagen are constantly being praised for how good they are, despite the fact that they appear in what is the equivalent of just 10 to 20 episodes or chapters of a manga. Yet I think that FolkQUEEN falls into that category as well. The story behind it, the way in how she managed to break the previous record for over 2 full seconds, and everything involved in this is such a fantastic thing to watch and such a fantastic thing to see, that I truly believe that once this arc is actually animated, it might be one of the best arcs individually in all of Spokon. Might be one of the, if not the best in modern Spokon by itself. And that is the reason as to why I am so happy to started reading this manga and knowing this franchise, because of moments like this, because of moments like the story of Horlicks and FolkQUEEN unveiling. And this second Japan Cup as a whole, and this incident is the perfect example as to how good this franchise is as a whole, with all of the stories around them, with all of the crazy things happening, how this was a before and after for the history of Japanese horse racing, and how this, I believe that is gonna be a before and after once it came out. But sadly, all of the great things that I'm mentioning has to come to an end. And just like that, the real story also had to come to an end. And this third section is the entirety of the ending of the manga, or what is the final races of Oguri Cup. In this last 1.5 saga, all of the things after the Japan Cup, we start seeing once again the things that could happen with the retirement. In the manga, they managed to portray basically everything of the best things that we have seen in other pieces of media of the franchise. We see how the Three Legends era comes to an end due to the injuries for basically all of the horses. How Super Creek come from being a champion to stop being there. How Inari One came from being a champion to reducing a lot her quality race over race until finally retiring, and also how one of the injuries basically derailed the career for Oguri Cup moving forward to the point that she was not the same as before. She stopped being Oguri Cup. And as you can imagine, the emotions behind this are so insane. For a character that her whole reason to live was because she was able to run, not being able to run as she used to was absolutely devastating. And we see it for almost the entirety of it. How she stops being the one to beat, and now all of a sudden, after going first in one race and then second in the other, she falls out of the top 5. And how she stops being the brightest point in the sky of the Japanese horse racing in Japan. And this is when we start watching the deepest part in all of Cinderella Grey. We do not see only her story, but rather the story of others. How the generation after hers was a generation of nothingness. How every single horse met really no expectations and nobody cared about them. And we see that also in real life. How certain people, after being alongside some truly legendary moments, after those moments are done, you don't know what is expecting us for the future. And this is the same thing. The following year, the following generation was seen as a nothingness, and everyone was struggling because of that. It was one of the worst, if not the single worst generation in the history of Japanese horse racing, because they had no expectations and nothing to go for. Oguri Cup and the Three Legends were so dominant that nothing else mattered, and they showed those struggles. But not only that, we saw some of the most important moments, in my opinion. How certain secondary characters that we have met for a long time are actually here as well. In Jaino Muteki, how she struggled so much with such a beast of a generation. She was just the 4th best in her own generation, meaning that she was not able to compete with the Three Legends. Yet despite all of that, we see her win races at this point of her career. She managed to win against Oguri Cup, even at this point, after so many years of not doing anything. She was there. And all of this concludes with the final races of Oguri Cup. How she goes down into her mental state of absolute despair, of not being able to be the horse that she once used to be. How she had all of those expectations of being the Grey Monster, the best horse in all of Japan. How she had the expectation of being the last horse to retire of the Three Legends. And how she just could not exceed nor even match those expectations anymore, because she was old and she didn't have what it was needed anymore. The way in which she goes down into a downward spiral, not only of despair but also a depression, is absolutely horrendous to see in a good way. It's so sad because it's something that is real. How certain athletes can no longer stand there. Just like how the story of Kita-san Black ends, but in a much bittersweet tone, with much worse results. And how she goes out of it by remembering the original and important things. How she was not running there because she wanted to win. How she was not running there because she wanted to set a new record nor mark a new era, but rather how she was racing because she just can do it. And after that happens is when we get the final race of the story, how a legendary career comes to an end in an equally as legendary race against newcomers that are gonna set their own era, against some old faces like the also retiring Jano Muteki. She is the one that is gonna be the most important. How she and her career comes to an end, but it goes as the same way that it always was, which was in a legendary way with the first place, and how one of the greatest horses in the history of Japan finishes her career, not only as one of the greatest stories in Japanese horse racing, not only as one of the greatest stories in horse racing, but as one of the greatest stories in sports history. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you all enjoyed it. If you want more content like this, reviewing different things and especially a lot of Musume, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps the channel to grow and it helps you to make me realize that you actually enjoy this content and that you are an amazing person that loves amazing things. So, without anything else to explain, I hope that you all enjoyed it and see you next time. Bye bye.